Have you ever wondered what happens when love becomes the foundation for protecting a nation's soul? When a marriage built on shared dreams transforms into the ultimate act of patriotic sacrifice? When the walls of America's grandest home become the secret fortress protecting our most precious cultural treasures? Tonight, I'm going to take you inside one of the most extraordinary untold stories of World War II. A tale that reveals how a love story that began on the deck of an ocean liner in 1897 would ultimately save some of America's greatest artistic masterpieces from the ravages of war. This isn't just another war story. This is the remarkable account of how Biltmore Estate, built as a testament to love and beauty, became America's most secret wartime fortress. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about duty, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve your country when everything you hold dear hangs in the balance. Because buried in the archives of both the National Gallery of Art and the Biltmore Estate lies documentation of an operation so classified, so dangerous, and so essential that it remained hidden from the American public for years. This is the story of George and Edith Vanderbilt, whose marriage created more than just a magnificent home. It established a legacy of service that would prove crucial when America faced its darkest hour. This is the story of David Finley, the first director of the National Gallery of Art, whose friendship with Edith Vanderbilt led to one of the most audacious cultural preservation efforts in human history. And this is the story of how a palace built for love became the secret sanctuary that protected the very soul of American culture. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just about art or architecture or even war. This is about the invisible threads that connect love, duty, and sacrifice. It's about how personal relationships become the foundation for national service. It's about the choices we make when everything we've built is threatened by forces beyond our control. I've spent months researching this extraordinary tale, diving deep into archived letters, military records, and testimonies that have been preserved for over 80 years. What I discovered will shake you to your core, because this story proves that sometimes the greatest acts of patriotism happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when ordinary people choose to risk everything they hold sacred for the sake of something greater than themselves. Picture this. It's December 1897, and the luxury ocean liner SS St. Paul cuts through the Atlantic waves, carrying passengers toward England, Egypt, and India. Among those passengers is George Washington Vanderbilt II, a 35-year-old bachelor whose wealth and position have made him one of America's most eligible men. But George isn't interested in the usual pursuits of Gilded Age society. He's a scholar, a bibliophile, a man who values intellect over ostentation and substance over spectacle. Also aboard this ship is Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman whose intelligence and grace would soon capture the heart of the man who would build America's largest private home. Their meeting wasn't orchestrated by society matchmakers or arranged by ambitious families. It was the result of pure chance, two souls finding each other in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. George's friend William Osgood Field would later write about that fateful voyage, describing how he watched his companion fall under the spell of the remarkable woman who shared their evening conversations. They spent their time reading books aloud to each other, playing cards, and engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that revealed the depth of character beneath their refined exteriors. Field observed with growing amazement that his usually reserved friend was completely smitten. This wasn't the typical romance of the Gilded Age, built on social advancement or financial consolidation. This was something far more powerful and enduring. George and Edith discovered in each other kindred spirits who shared a love of learning, a passion for travel, and most importantly, a deep understanding that privilege came with responsibility to serve others. Their courtship continued across continents and through correspondence that revealed two minds perfectly matched in their values and aspirations. George wrote to Edith about his dreams for the estate he was building in the mountains of North Carolina, describing not just a magnificent house, but a vision of what their life together could become. A place where beauty and learning could flourish, where community service could take root, where their love could create something lasting and meaningful. Edith responded with equal passion about her own hopes for using wealth and position to benefit others, particularly through education and community development. She shared George's belief that their privileged circumstances came with obligations to lift up those around them. Their letters revealed two people falling in love not just with each other, but with the possibility of what they could accomplish together. The wedding that followed was as remarkable for what it wasn't as for what it was. On June 1, 1898, in a simple town hall ceremony in Paris, France, George and Edith exchanged vows in what one newspaper described as the most unostentatious Vanderbilt wedding since the family had made its fortune. There was no grand cathedral, no elaborate reception, no society photographers documenting every moment for the gossip pages. Instead, there was quiet contentment, genuine affection, and an altogether marked absence of display. The couple had chosen authenticity over spectacle, intimacy over grandeur. This choice revealed everything about the values that would guide their marriage and ultimately make possible their extraordinary service to their country during its greatest crisis. Following their Parisian wedding, the newlyweds retreated to a peaceful villa near Lake Maggiore in Italy, where they spent the summer exploring alpine scenery and visiting some of Europe's finest museums and galleries. This honeymoon wasn't about luxury resorts or fashionable destinations. It was about two people sharing their passion for art, culture, and natural beauty while building the foundation of a partnership that would endure for decades. It wasn't until after this extended European sojourn that Edith first laid eyes on Biltmore, the magnificent estate that George had been building in the mountains of North Carolina. The house that would become her home represented everything about George's character and vision. It was grand beyond imagination, yet designed with purpose and meaning rather than mere ostentation. The estate workers lined the approach road to welcome their new mistress, creating a giant horseshoe of goldenrod flowers with the phrase, "Welcome home," to greet the couple as they arrived. This warm reception reflected the genuine affection that George had earned through his fair treatment and generous policies toward those who worked for him. He had built not just a house, but a community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The birth of their daughter Cornelia on August 22, 1900, transformed Biltmore from a magnificent house into a true home. Local newspapers celebrated the arrival of this new star at famous Biltmore, noting how the charming mistress of this gorgeous home smiled upon her firstborn. The world shared in her newfound happiness, recognizing that something special was taking root in the mountains of North Carolina. But George and Edith Vanderbilt weren't content to live in isolated splendor, no matter how beautiful their surroundings. Their love for each other had awakened an even deeper love for their community and their country. They understood that their extraordinary privilege came with extraordinary responsibility to serve others. They established schools throughout the mountains of Appalachia, bringing education to families who had never imagined such opportunities for their children. George helped create the Biltmore Forest School, America's first institute for scientific forestry, while Edith started programs to teach young women essential life skills. They bankrolled Biltmore Industries, a textile company that employed local workers and taught valuable skills like weaving and woodworking. Their charitable work extended far beyond formal organizations. Edith personally delivered food and medicine to estate workers' families when needed, bringing gifts when babies were born and comfort when loved ones were lost. She was known to ride on horseback through mountain trails to deliver wool and other necessities to isolated families struggling to survive in harsh conditions. George and Edith didn't perform these acts of service for publicity or recognition. They did it because it was the right thing to do, without seeking credit or acknowledgement. This pattern of quiet service and genuine care for others established relationships and trust that would prove essential when their country faced its greatest crisis. The vast scale and sophisticated infrastructure of Biltmore made it uniquely suited for extraordinary purposes. The main house itself was a marvel of engineering and construction, built with the finest materials and most advanced technologies available at the time. A woodworking factory and brick kiln were constructed on site, while a 3-mile railroad spur brought materials directly to the building location. Construction required the labor of approximately 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons working with limestone, brick, and steel to create what was essentially a fireproof palace. George made extensive trips overseas during construction to purchase thousands of furnishings, including tapestries, carpets, and decorative objects dating from the 15th century to the late 19th century. The house that emerged from these efforts was the largest privately owned residence in the United States, with over 178,000 square feet of floor space and 135,000 square feet of living area. But more than its size, the house represented a commitment to preserving and celebrating the highest achievements of human culture and artistry. Little did George and Edith know that the home they had built as a testament to love and beauty would one day become America's most secret fortress, protecting the nation's greatest artistic treasures during its darkest hour. Their love story was about to become something far greater than a personal romance. It was about to become the foundation for one of the most extraordinary acts of patriotic service in American history. The stage was being set for a drama that would test everything George and Edith Vanderbilt had built together, everything they believed about duty and sacrifice, everything they understood about the relationship between private happiness and public service. Their love had created something magnificent. Soon, the world would discover whether that love was strong enough to risk everything in service of their country's survival. The year 1914 brought tragedy that would reshape the Vanderbilt family forever. George Washington, Vanderbilt II, at just 51 years old, died suddenly from complications following an appendectomy. In an instant, Edith found herself a widow with a 14-year-old daughter and the enormous responsibility of maintaining the vast estate that had been their shared dream. The loss devastated Edith in ways that those closest to her could barely comprehend. She had lost not just a husband, but her intellectual partner, her fellow dreamer, her companion in service to their community. The man who had shared her vision of using wealth for the betterment of others was gone, leaving her to carry forward their mission alone. But grief, rather than breaking Edith's spirit, seemed to strengthen her resolve. She understood that George's death meant she now bore the full weight of their shared responsibilities. The estate employees who had welcomed her with such warmth 20 years earlier now looked to her for leadership. The mountain families they had served together still needed education and support. The legacy they had built together required her steady hand to guide it forward. Edith threw herself into the work with a determination that amazed those around her. She expanded the educational programs they had started, increased support for local families, and maintained the estate as a beacon of cultural sophistication in the remote mountains of North Carolina. She opened Biltmore House to public tours, believing that the beauty and artistry George had assembled should be shared with visitors from around the world. The decision to open their home to the public revealed something profound about Edith's character. She could have retreated into private grief, closing the estate to outsiders and living quietly among her memories. Instead, she chose to honor George's legacy by making Biltmore a place where people could experience the highest achievements of human culture and artistry. Visitors came from across the country to walk through the magnificent rooms, to see the priceless tapestries and paintings that George had collected during his travels, to experience the gardens and grounds that had been designed as earthly paradise. Edith greeted many of these guests personally, sharing stories about the estate's creation and her husband's vision for what it could become. Among those visitors was a young man named David Finley. who would later become one of the most important figures in American cultural preservation. Finley was immediately struck not just by the magnificence of Biltmore, but by Edith's deep knowledge of art and her genuine passion for sharing that knowledge with others. Their friendship began over discussions of the Italian Renaissance paintings that graced the walls of Biltmore House. Finley was pursuing advanced studies in art history, while Edith had lived surrounded by masterpieces for decades. She had learned about each piece from George, who had personally selected every painting, sculpture, and decorative object during their travels together. As their friendship deepened over the years, Finley came to understand that Edith represented something rare in American society. She possessed not just wealth and position, but genuine expertise in matters of art and culture. More importantly, she had demonstrated through her stewardship of Biltmore that she understood the responsibility that came with being a guardian of cultural treasures. Finley's career in cultural preservation was taking shape during these same years. He worked his way up through various government positions, always focused on protecting and promoting American arts and culture. His expertise and dedication eventually led to his appointment as the first director of the National Gallery of Art when that institution opened its doors in Washington. The gallery's opening in March 1941 represented the culmination of decades of effort to create a world-class repository for artistic masterpieces in the nation's capital. Andrew Mellon's extraordinary gift of funds and artworks had made the museum possible, but it fell to Finley to transform that vision into reality. Standing in the magnificent galleries on opening day, surrounded by paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, and countless other masters, Finley felt the weight of responsibility that came with protecting such irreplaceable treasures. Each work represented not just monetary value, but centuries of human achievement in capturing beauty, truth, and meaning through artistic expression. But even as he celebrated the gallery's successful opening, Finley couldn't ignore the ominous events unfolding across the Atlantic. War had already consumed much of Europe, and reports reaching Washington painted a terrifying picture of cultural destruction accompanying military conquest. Nazi forces had systematically looted artwork from occupied territories, stripping museums and private collections of their greatest treasures. In some cases, pieces that had survived for centuries were destroyed simply because they didn't align with Nazi ideology about acceptable art. The systematic destruction of Jewish-owned collections was particularly horrifying, representing not just theft, but cultural genocide. London, America's closest ally, was enduring nightly bombing raids that left historic buildings in ruins and cultural institutions damaged or destroyed. If the British capital, with all its defenses and preparations, could suffer such devastation, what would prevent similar attacks on Washington if America entered the war? Finley found himself lying awake at night, imagining scenarios that made his blood run cold. What if Nazi submarines managed to shell the American coast? What if enemy aircraft somehow reached Washington and targeted the symbols of American democracy? The Capitol, the White House, and the National Gallery were all located within a small area that could be devastated by a single, successful attack. The proximity of these fears became starkly real just 2 days after the gallery's opening, when London suffered one of its worst bombing raids of the entire war. The timing felt like a cosmic warning about the vulnerability of cultural institutions during wartime. Finley began developing contingency plans almost immediately. His first step was to consult with security experts and military advisors about the realistic threats facing Washington. Their assessments were sobering. While a full-scale invasion seemed unlikely, the possibility of bombing raids or sabotage attacks could not be dismissed. Enemy agents were already known to be operating within the United States, and the capital represented the most valuable target in the country. The experts recommended dispersing the gallery's most valuable pieces to secure locations far from Washington, preferably in areas that would be unlikely targets for enemy action. But finding suitable locations presented enormous challenges. The artworks required climate-controlled environments, sophisticated security measures, and complete protection from fire, flood, and other natural disasters. Most critically, any location used for such purposes would need to maintain absolute secrecy. If enemy agents discovered where America's greatest artistic treasures were hidden, those locations would immediately become priority targets for attack. The entire operation would need to be conducted with the kind of operational security typically reserved for the most classified military activities. As Finley wrestled with these seemingly impossible requirements, his thoughts kept returning to a conversation he'd had with Edith Vanderbilt during one of his visits to Biltmore. She had mentioned the unique construction features of the house, particularly its fireproof design and remote location in the mountains of North Carolina. The more he considered it, the more perfect Biltmore seemed for his purposes. The house was built like a fortress, with limestone walls and steel construction that would resist both fire and attack. Its location deep in the Appalachian Mountains made it an unlikely target for enemy action, while its distance from major cities provided additional security. Perhaps most importantly, Finley trusted Edith Vanderbilt completely. Their friendship had been built over years of shared conversations about art, culture, and the responsibility of preserving beauty for future generations. He knew that she understood the gravity of what he was contemplating, and that her patriotism ran as deep as her love for the arts. The decision to approach Edith about using Biltmore as a wartime repository represented a convergence of friendship, practical necessity, and absolute trust. Finley knew he was asking his friend to risk everything she held dear for the sake of protecting America's cultural heritage. The estate that had been her home, her refuge, and her life's work would become a target if the secret operation were ever discovered. But he also knew that if anyone would understand the importance of such sacrifice, it would be the woman who had already demonstrated her commitment to service through decades of quiet work in her mountain community. Edith Vanderbilt had spent her entire adult life understanding that privilege came with responsibility. Now Finley was about to ask her to prove that understanding in the most dramatic way possible. The conversation that would determine the fate of America's greatest artistic treasures was about to take place between two friends who shared a deep love of culture and an even deeper love of country. What happened next would transform a love story that began on an ocean liner into one of the most extraordinary acts of patriotic service in American history. Service in American history. The telephone call that would change everything came on a crisp autumn morning in 1941. David Finley sat in his office at the National Gallery, staring out at the Washington skyline while wrestling with a decision that kept him awake at night. The reports from Europe grew more terrifying each day. Paris had fallen. London burned nightly under German bombs, and somewhere across the Atlantic, Nazi forces were systematically destroying or stealing every piece of art they could find. Finley picked up the phone with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was about to ask. The number he dialed connected him to Biltmore Estate, to a woman who had become one of his dearest friends over the years, to someone whose judgment and character he trusted more than anyone else in the world. When Edith Vanderbilt's familiar voice came through the receiver, Finley found himself struggling to find the right words. How do you ask someone to risk everything they hold sacred? How do you explain that the very survival of American culture might depend on their willingness to transform their beloved home into a fortress? "Edith," he began, his voice carrying the weight of urgent necessity, "I need to ask you something that might sound impossible. If our country goes to war, would you consider allowing us to bring some of the nation's most precious artworks to Biltmore for safekeeping?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but to Finley it felt like an eternity. He was asking her to turn the house where she had raised her daughter, where she had built a life with George, where every room held memories of their shared dreams, into a potential target for enemy action. Edith's response came without hesitation, clear and firm and absolutely certain. "Of course, David. Whatever our country needs." Those 6 words changed the course of American cultural history. In that moment, A widow who had already sacrificed so much chose to risk everything she had left for the sake of protecting treasures that belonged not to her, but to all Americans. Her immediate agreement revealed the depth of her patriotism and her understanding of what was truly at stake. But Edith's willingness to help was only the beginning of an enormously complex undertaking. Finley hung up the phone knowing that he had secured the perfect location for his secret operation, but also knowing that the challenges ahead would test every aspect of their friendship and their shared commitment to preserving American culture. The first step was conducting a thorough security assessment of Biltmore itself. Finley dispatched a team of specialists to North Carolina under the cover of routine museum consultations. These experts examined every aspect of the estate, from its structural integrity to its fire suppression systems, from its remote location to the reliability of local law enforcement. Their report exceeded even Finley's most optimistic expectations. Biltmore House was essentially a fireproof fortress, built with limestone walls and steel construction that would resist almost any conceivable threat. The estate's location deep in the Appalachian Mountains made it nearly impossible to attack without extensive advance warning. Most importantly, the house contained rooms that could be easily modified for secure storage without compromising the building's structural integrity. The music room emerged as the perfect location for their purposes. This unfinished space with brick walls and pine flooring was already excluded from public tours, making it ideal for conversion into a secure vault. The room's position within the house provided multiple layers of protection, while its size would accommodate the artworks they needed to relocate. Converting the music room into a fortress within a fortress required extraordinary secrecy and precision. Workers arrived at Biltmore under various pretexts, ostensibly making routine maintenance and improvements to the estate. In reality, they were installing steel-vaulted doors in the archways and steel bars over the windows, creating an impenetrable sanctuary within the elegant confines of the Vanderbilt mansion. The steel doors were carefully concealed behind tapestries that matched the room's existing decor, ensuring that visitors could walk past without suspecting what lay hidden behind those delicate folds. Fire extinguishers and alarm systems were discreetly installed, while steel racks were constructed to properly support the paintings that would soon call this room home. Throughout this preparation phase, Edith Vanderbilt maintained her regular schedule of activities, greeting visitors, overseeing estate operations, and participating in her various community service projects. No one suspected that America's greatest private residence was being transformed into the nation's most secret cultural fortress. The selection of which artworks to relocate proved almost as challenging as preparing their destination. Finley and his team faced the agonizing task of choosing which pieces were too valuable to risk leaving in Washington. Every painting, every sculpture in the National Gallery's collection represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. But practical limitations meant they could only protect a fraction of their holdings. The final list read like a roster of human artistic achievement. Gilbert Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image that graced currency and classrooms across America, would make the journey to North Carolina. Raphael's masterpieces, including his portrait of Bindo Altoviti, were deemed too precious to remain in the capital. Works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Goya, and Titian joined the Asiua May, collection destined for secret exile in the mountains. Each piece carried not just monetary value, but symbolic importance that went to the heart of American identity and values. These were the works that defined civilization itself, the artistic achievements that proved humanity's capacity for creating beauty even in the darkest times. Protecting them meant preserving the very soul of American culture for future generations. The logistics of transporting such priceless cargo presented challenges that would have daunted military strategists. Each artwork required special crating designed to protect against shock, vibration, temperature changes, and humidity fluctuations. The crates themselves had to be unmarked and unremarkable, giving no indication of their precious contents to casual observers. Security arrangements involved multiple layers of protection and deception. The artworks would travel by rail, the most secure form of long-distance transportation available, but their route and timing would be classified at the highest levels. Armed guards would accompany the shipment, but they would be dressed as ordinary railroad employees to avoid drawing attention. The timing of the operation was dictated by events beyond anyone's control. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed theoretical preparations into urgent necessity. America was now at war, and the capital city had become a potential target for enemy action. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Finley's carefully laid plans swung into motion with the precision of a military operation. On a cold January night in 1942, as snow began falling across the eastern United States, 62 paintings and 17 sculptures were loaded aboard a specially equipped train car in Washington's Union Station. The train that departed into the winter darkness carried more than artwork. It carried the distilled essence of human creativity, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of artistic achievement, the cultural foundation upon which American civilization rested. Every mile of track brought these treasures closer to safety, but also deeper into the unknown risks of a secret operation unprecedented in American history. Edith Vanderbilt waited at Biltmore as the train made its way through the Virginia countryside and into the foothills of North Carolina. She understood that in a matter of hours, her peaceful mountain estate would become one of the most heavily guarded locations in the entire country. Armed sentries would patrol her garden, steel doors would seal off sections of her home, and the house where she had found such happiness would become a fortress protecting America's greatest artistic treasures. The woman who had opened her home to thousands of visitors was about to close it to all but a select few who possessed the highest security clearances. The estate that had been built as a celebration of beauty and culture was about to become a vault where that same beauty and culture would hide from a world gone mad with war. As snow continued to fall across the mountains of western North Carolina, Edith stood at her window watching the empty approach road and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had married for love, lost her husband too soon, and spent decades honoring his memory through service to their community. Now she was being asked to risk everything they had built together for the sake of something even greater than their personal happiness. The train carrying America's artistic soul was approaching through the winter storm, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's most precious treasures. The love story that began on an ocean liner 45 years earlier was about to reach its most dramatic and dangerous chapter. The convoy that wound its way through the treacherous mountain roads that January night in 1942 carried more than precious cargo. It carried the weight of American cultural identity through conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced drivers under normal circumstances. The snow fell with relentless intensity, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes and making every turn of the winding approach road a test of nerves and skill. David Finley rode in the lead vehicle, his hands gripping the door handle as the truck navigated the icy curves that climbed toward Biltmore House. Behind him, specially equipped vehicles carried crates containing some of the most valuable objects in human history, each one wrapped in protective materials and secured against the jolting motion of the treacherous journey. The approach road that had once welcomed wedding guests and society visitors now served as the final leg of one of the most dangerous art transport operations ever attempted. Every pothole threatened disaster. Every steep grade risked catastrophic failure. Every icy patch could send millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable masterpieces tumbling down the mountainside. Finley found himself sweating despite the bitter cold, his imagination conjuring horrific scenarios of Raphael's Alba Madonna sliding from its moorings, of Vermeer's delicate brushwork being shattered by a single moment of mechanical failure. The responsibility he carried felt heavier than the physical weight of the artworks themselves. These weren't just paintings and sculptures. They were the visual DNA of Western civilization, the accumulated genius of centuries of human creativity. The estate workers who had been secretly briefed about the operation waited in the darkness near the house, their faces grim with understanding of what was at stake. They had been sworn to absolute secrecy, knowing that a single careless word could transform their peaceful mountain home into a target for enemy sabotage. These were people who had served the Vanderbilt family for decades, whose loyalty had been earned through years of fair treatment and mutual respect. As the convoy finally reached the circular drive in front of Biltmore House, Edith Vanderbilt emerged from the main entrance with a composure that masked the anxiety she felt watching this dangerous operation unfold at her doorstep. She had spent the evening pacing through rooms that would soon house treasures she had only seen hanging in distant museums, wondering whether she was making the right choice in risking everything her family had built. The unloading process began immediately, despite the continuing snowfall and the late hour. Each crate was handled with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, carried by teams of specially trained handlers who understood that a single slip could destroy something that had survived for centuries. The snow muffled their footsteps as they moved through the ornate halls of Biltmore House, transforming the elegant mansion into something resembling a midnight funeral procession. The music room, with its newly installed steel doors and concealed security measures, received its first residents in an atmosphere of hushed solemnity. As each crate was carefully positioned on the specially constructed racks, the room gradually transformed from an empty space into a treasure vault that contained more artistic wealth than most museums could dream of possessing. Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, the face that had gazed from classroom walls and government buildings across America for generations, found itself sharing space with Titian's Venus with a mirror, a masterpiece that had adorned European palaces for centuries before making its way to American shores. The juxtaposition seemed to symbolize everything that was at stake in this war. American democratic ideals standing alongside the artistic achievements of the old world they were fighting to preserve. Raphael's Bindo Altoviti, painted during the height of the Italian Renaissance, was positioned near works by Rembrandt that captured the golden age of Dutch culture. These pieces represented not just individual artistic achievement, but entire civilizations at their creative peaks. Protecting them meant preserving humanity's greatest accomplishments for whatever world would emerge from the current chaos. The installation of round-the-clock security began immediately after the last artwork was safely positioned. Armed guards took their posts at strategic locations throughout the estate, their presence carefully disguised to maintain the illusion that Biltmore remained nothing more than a tourist attraction and private residence. Visitors who arrived during daylight hours would see uniformed security personnel, but they would assume these guards were simply estate employees protecting the Vanderbilt family's property. The deception required extraordinary coordination between multiple agencies and individuals. Federal security services provided the armed guards and sophisticated surveillance equipment, while estate staff maintained their normal routines to avoid arousing suspicion. Local law enforcement received carefully crafted explanations for the increased activity, stories that contained just enough truth to be believable without revealing the operation's true nature. Edith Vanderbilt found herself living a double life that would have challenged the most experienced intelligence operative. During daylight hours, she continued her role as gracious hostess and community leader, greeting visitors with the same warmth she had always shown while carefully steering conversations away from topics that might lead to uncomfortable questions. Her decades of experience in society had taught her the art of revealing nothing while appearing to share everything. The psychological strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception began to take its toll on everyone involved in the operation. Finley made regular visits to Biltmore under various pretexts, officially consulting on museum matters while actually checking on the security and condition of the hidden artworks. Each visit required him to balance his genuine concern for the collection with the need to maintain absolute secrecy about his true purpose. The estate staff who were aware of the operation found themselves constantly vigilant for signs that their secret might be discovered. Every visitor was scrutinized, every conversation monitored for hints that someone might suspect what was hidden behind those concealed steel doors. The weight of protecting such an enormous secret created bonds among the conspirators that went far beyond their professional relationships. Meanwhile, the artworks themselves settled into their mountain exile with the silent patience that only inanimate objects can possess. The climate-controlled environment maintained perfect conditions for their preservation, while the sophisticated fire suppression system stood ready to protect them from the threat that had destroyed so many cultural treasures throughout history. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that these masterpieces, created to be seen and admired by the public, now hid in darkness behind steel doors and armed guards. Paintings that had hung in the palaces of kings and the galleries of great museums now waited in secret for a world safe enough to display them openly again. The success of the operation's first phase brought relief, mixed with growing awareness that their real challenges were just beginning. Keeping the artwork safe during transport had been difficult enough, but maintaining their security for an indefinite period while preserving absolute secrecy would require sustained vigilance and flawless execution by everyone involved. Reports from the war front reinforced the wisdom of their precautions. Nazi forces continued their systematic destruction and theft of cultural treasures across occupied Europe, while American cities began implementing blackout procedures and air raid drills. The possibility that Washington itself might face bombing attacks no longer seemed like paranoid fantasy, but realistic preparation for probable events. The National Gallery in Washington continued operating with its remaining collection, but staff members found themselves constantly aware of the empty spaces where their greatest treasures had once hung. Visitors continued to arrive, unaware that they were seeing only a fraction of the museum's holdings, while guards and curators shared the burden of knowing where the missing masterpieces had gone. Back at Biltmore, the rhythm of daily life gradually adapted to accommodate the extraordinary circumstances that now defined the estate's existence. Tour guides learned to navigate around restricted areas without drawing attention to the changes, while maintenance staff incorporated additional security checks into their normal routines. The elaborate dance of deception became so practiced that it appeared completely natural to outside observers. Edith Vanderbilt discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed as she balanced the demands of maintaining normal operations with the stress of protecting America's greatest cultural treasures. Her morning routine now included security briefings that would have been classified at the highest government levels, while her afternoon tea conversations required constant vigilance to avoid revealing anything about the secrets hidden within her home. The transformation of Biltmore from private residence to national fortress represented something unprecedented in American history. Never before had a private citizen been asked to risk their family's legacy for the sake of protecting the nation's cultural heritage. Never before had the intimate spaces of a personal home been converted into a high-security vault for treasures belonging to all Americans. As winter gradually gave way to spring in the mountains of North Carolina, the success of the Biltmore operation became increasingly apparent. The artworks remained safe and secure while the secret of their location stayed perfectly protected. But everyone involved understood that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. As the war intensified and the risks to America's homeland grew more serious with each passing month. The love story that had begun with George and Edith's meeting on an ocean liner had evolved into something far greater than personal romance. It had become a testament to the power of private virtue to serve public necessity, of individual sacrifice to preserve collective heritage, of love to create something strong enough to protect the very soul of American civilization during its darkest hour. The months that followed brought challenges that tested every aspect of the elaborate deception that had transformed Biltmore into America's most secret cultural fortress. As spring arrived in the mountains of North Carolina, the estate faced its first major crisis, when a routine inspection by state fire officials threatened to expose the entire operation. The fire marshal who arrived that warm April morning had no idea that he was about to walk through a building containing more artistic wealth than most European museums. His visit was prompted by new wartime regulations requiring enhanced safety measures at all public facilities, a perfectly reasonable request that sent waves of panic through everyone who knew what was really hidden behind those concealed steel doors. Edith Vanderbilt met the inspector with the same gracious hospitality she had always shown official visitors, guiding him through the public areas of the house while carefully avoiding any route that might lead near the music room. Her decades of experience as a hostess served her well as she engaged him in conversations about the estate's history and architecture, drawing his attention to the magnificent rooms that tourists regularly admired while steering him away from areas that could expose their secret. The inspection proceeded smoothly until the fire marshal noticed discrepancies in the building's floor plan that suggested spaces were being used differently than originally intended. His trained eye detected the subtle signs of recent modifications, the barely visible evidence of construction work that had transformed ordinary rooms into something far more secure and sophisticated. David Finley received an urgent telephone call that afternoon, his heart racing as Edith described the inspector's questions and his growing suspicion that something unusual was happening at Biltmore. The success of their entire operation hung in the balance as they worked frantically to develop plausible explanations for the modifications that had been discovered. The solution came through the estate's established reputation for community service and wartime patriotism. They explained the security improvements as precautions designed to protect the Vanderbilt family's own art collection from potential wartime threats, a story that contained enough truth to be completely believable. The fire marshal accepted their explanations and approved the enhanced safety measures, never suspecting that he had just certified the security arrangements protecting America's greatest artistic treasures. The close call reinforced everyone's understanding of how precarious their situation remained. Every visitor, every delivery, every routine interaction carried the potential for discovery and disaster. The estate staff developed increasingly sophisticated protocols for managing these risks, creating elaborate systems of signals and procedures that allowed them to respond instantly to any threat to their secret. Summer brought new challenges as tourism to the estate increased dramatically. Wartime gas rationing had made distant travel more difficult, leading many families to vacation closer to home. Biltmore's reputation as one of America's most magnificent attractions drew record crowds of visitors eager to experience a taste of luxury during increasingly austere times. The increased foot traffic required constant vigilance from security personnel, who had to maintain their cover while watching for any signs of suspicious behavior. Every photographer had to be monitored to ensure they didn't capture images of restricted areas. Every curious guest who wandered from the designated tour route had to be gently redirected without creating the impression that anything was being hidden. Edith found herself serving as the primary guardian of their secret, her presence at the estate providing the perfect cover for the enhanced security measures. Visitors expected to see guards protecting the valuable Vanderbilt collection, making the armed personnel seem like a natural precaution rather than evidence of a classified government operation. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception for months on end began affecting everyone involved in different ways. Some of the guards struggled with the isolation of their assignment, unable to discuss their work with family or friends back home. Estate workers who had been trusted with the secret found themselves constantly anxious about accidentally revealing something that could compromise the operation. Finley made increasingly frequent visits to Biltmore, officially consulting on various museum projects while actually monitoring the condition of the hidden artworks and the morale of the people protecting them. Each trip reinforced his appreciation for the extraordinary sacrifice that Edith was making, not just in terms of the physical risk to her property, but in the emotional burden of living with such an enormous secret. The artworks themselves remained in perfect condition within their climate-controlled sanctuary, but their enforced isolation seemed to mirror the broader isolation felt by everyone involved in protecting them. These masterpieces had been created to inspire and educate, to connect people across centuries through shared appreciation of beauty and meaning. Now they waited in darkness, their power held in reserve until the world became safe enough to display them openly again. Reports from the European war front continued to justify the precautions they had taken. Nazi forces had systematically stripped the great museums of Paris, sending trainloads of stolen artwork back to Germany while destroying pieces they deemed unworthy of preservation. The fate of countless masterpieces remained unknown, their survival dependent on the courage of individuals who risked their lives to hide cultural treasures from occupying forces. The contrast between the destruction occurring across Europe and the preservation happening at Biltmore reinforced everyone's understanding of the historical significance of their mission. They were not just protecting individual artworks, but preserving the continuity of human cultural achievement. If American civilization survived this war, future generations would be able to experience these masterpieces because of the sacrifices being made in a mountain mansion in North Carolina. The autumn of 1942 brought news that transformed the entire context of their operation. Allied forces had achieved their first major victory against Nazi Germany with the success of Operation Torch in North Africa. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans could envision a path to eventual victory, though everyone understood that years of hard fighting still lay ahead. The changing military situation created new challenges for the Biltmore operation as government priorities shifted and resources were redirected toward supporting the expanding war effort. Finley found himself defending the continued protection of the artworks against officials who argued that the immediate threat to the American homeland had diminished sufficiently to allow their return to Washington. These debates revealed the fundamental tension between short-term military expediency and long-term cultural preservation. The war was far from over, and the possibility of devastating attacks on American cities remained very real. Japanese submarine activity off the East Coast and German spy operations within the United States demonstrated that the homeland was not immune from enemy action. Edith Vanderbilt's voice proved crucial in these discussions. Her credibility as someone who had already sacrificed enormously for the war effort giving weight to her arguments for continued vigilance. She understood better than anyone the risks involved in their operation, but she also understood that premature exposure of the artworks could prove catastrophic if the war's fortunes suddenly turned against the Allies. The winter of 1942 marked the first anniversary of the artwork's arrival at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on everything that had been accomplished and everything that still needed to be done. The secret had been kept perfectly despite countless opportunities for exposure. The artworks remained in pristine condition despite being housed in facilities never intended for such purposes. Most remarkably, the estate had continued functioning as a tourist attraction and private residence throughout this entire period, maintaining the normal rhythms of daily life while hiding one of the most important government operations in the country. Thousands of visitors had walked through the halls of Biltmore House without suspecting that they were within yards of America's greatest artistic treasures. The success of the operation had created its own form of psychological burden, as everyone involved realized they were participating in something historically unprecedented. The weight of responsibility for protecting such irreplaceable cultural heritage affected different people in different ways, but it touched everyone who knew the secret with a sense of participating in something far greater than their individual lives. Edith found herself thinking increasingly about George and what he would have thought about their home serving such an extraordinary purpose. She imagined him being proud of the way their shared vision of service had evolved into something that could protect the artistic achievements he had spent his lifetime collecting and preserving. The love story that had created Biltmore had reached its ultimate expression in this act of national service. As 1943 began, the operation that had started as an emergency measure was settling into a routine that could potentially continue for years. The war showed no signs of ending quickly, and the artworks had found a security and stability at Biltmore that exceeded anything they could have enjoyed in Washington. The mountain fortress that love had built was proving itself capable of protecting America's cultural soul through the greatest crisis in the nation's history. The story that had begun with a chance meeting on an ocean liner had become something far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Two people who had fallen in love while reading poetry together on the deck of a ship had created something strong enough to serve their country when that service required risking everything they had built together. Their legacy was being tested in ways they never could have anticipated, and it was proving equal to every challenge the world could present. The strain of maintaining absolute secrecy for over a year was beginning to show in ways that threatened the entire operation. By early 1943, the psychological pressure of living with such an enormous secret had created unexpected vulnerabilities among the estate staff who knew about the hidden treasures. Small changes in behavior, subtle signs of stress, and the gradual erosion of normal social interactions were becoming noticeable to visitors and community members who had no knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes. The most dangerous moment came when Margaret Sullivan, one of the longtime housekeeping staff who had been trusted with knowledge of the operation, began drinking heavily to cope with the anxiety of maintaining the deception. Her increasingly erratic behavior during public tours raised concerns that she might accidentally reveal something that could expose everything they had worked so hard to protect. Edith faced one of the most difficult decisions of her entire involvement in the operation when she realized that Margaret's deteriorating condition posed an unacceptable risk to national security. The woman, who had served the Vanderbilt family faithfully for over 20 years, who had helped raise Cornelia from childhood, who had been like family to everyone at the estate, now represented a potential catastrophe that could destroy America's most important cultural preservation effort. The conversation between Edith and Margaret took place in the privacy of the estate's rose garden, surrounded by blooms that George had planted decades earlier as a symbol of enduring beauty. Edith approached the subject with all the compassion she could muster, understanding that she was asking someone to leave the only home they had known for the sake of protecting secrets they could never fully understand. Margaret's response revealed the depth of loyalty that the Vanderbilt family had inspired through generations of fair treatment and genuine care for their employees. Despite her personal struggles, despite the pain of being asked to leave, she understood immediately what was at stake and agreed to relocate to a position with distant relatives in Virginia. Her sacrifice, like so many others connected to the Biltmore operation, demonstrated how individual acts of patriotism combined to protect something far greater than personal interests. The incident forced Finley and his security team to develop more sophisticated psychological support systems for the people involved in protecting the artworks. They brought in specialists who could provide counseling and stress management techniques without ever being told the true nature of what was causing the anxiety. The elaborate deceptions required to maintain operational security extended even to the mental health professionals who were helping to preserve the mental stability of the operation's participants. As spring returned to the mountains of North Carolina in 1943, the estate faced its most severe test yet when Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil, now married and living her own life, decided to visit her childhood home for an extended stay. Her arrival created complications that no one had anticipated when the operation was first planned, as her intimate knowledge of every corner of Biltmore House made it nearly impossible to conceal the modifications that had been made. Cornelia had grown up in these rooms, had played games that involved exploring every hidden corner and secret passage in the vast mansion. Her trained eye immediately noticed the subtle changes that had been made to accommodate the hidden artworks, the slight alterations in traffic patterns during tours, the barely perceptible signs that certain areas were now off-limits in ways they had never been before. The decision about whether to bring Cornelia into the secret became a source of intense debate among the operation's leadership. Her security clearance process would take weeks to complete, during which time she would remain at the estate as a potential security risk. Yet, her growing suspicion about the changes she was observing posed an equally serious threat to the operation's continued success. Edith found herself caught between her maternal instincts to protect her daughter and her patriotic duty to protect the nation's cultural treasures. The conversation in which she finally revealed the truth to Cornelia took place in the same room where George had first shown Edith the architectural plans for their magnificent home. Now that room became the setting for passing the torch of family responsibility to the next generation. Cornelia's reaction to learning about the secret operation revealed that she had inherited both her father's appreciation for art and her mother's commitment to service. Rather than being shocked or frightened by the revelation, she immediately began thinking about ways she could contribute to protecting the hidden treasures. Her fresh perspective and intimate knowledge of the estate proved invaluable in identifying additional security measures that could be implemented without arousing suspicion. The addition of Cornelia to their inner circle of trusted individuals created new opportunities for maintaining the operation's cover while strengthening its security. Her presence at the estate provided additional justification for the enhanced protection measures, as visitors naturally assumed that extra guards were necessary to protect both the Vanderbilt family and their valuable personal collection. Summer brought unprecedented challenges as war production created severe shortages of materials needed to maintain the climate-controlled environment protecting the artworks. The sophisticated heating and cooling systems that kept the hidden treasures in perfect condition required components that were now considered essential to the military effort. Finding replacement parts without revealing why they were needed became an ongoing struggle that tested everyone's ingenuity and connections. The solution came through the estate's long-standing relationships with local craftsmen and suppliers who had worked with the Vanderbilt family for decades. These skilled artisans, many of whom had learned their trades working on the original construction of Biltmore House, proved capable of fabricating replacement components using techniques and materials that had been abandoned by modern industry. Their willingness to undertake this challenging work without asking uncomfortable questions demonstrated the deep loyalty that the Vanderbilt family had earned through generations of fair dealing and community service. The technical challenges of maintaining perfect environmental conditions in a building that had never been designed for such purposes pushed everyone involved to develop innovative solutions that would influence museum practices for decades to come. The lessons learned at Biltmore about protecting valuable artworks in non-traditional settings would eventually be applied to cultural preservation efforts around the world. As autumn arrived in 1943, reports from the European theater brought news that transformed everyone's understanding of why their mission was so crucial. Allied forces advancing through Italy had discovered the extent of Nazi art looting operations, finding warehouses filled with stolen masterpieces that had been stripped from museums and private collections across occupied Europe. The systematic nature of this cultural theft exceeded even the worst fears that had motivated the Biltmore operation. Photographs of recovered artworks that had been damaged or destroyed during their forced relocation served as stark reminders of what could have happened to America's treasures if they had remained in Washington during the height of the war. The decision to move them to safety, which had seemed like an extreme precaution when it was first implemented, now appeared to have been absolutely essential for their survival. The vindication of their efforts brought both relief and renewed determination to maintain the operation's security until the war's end. Everyone involved understood that their success had preserved not just individual artworks, but entire centuries of human creative achievement that would have been lost forever if they had been destroyed in bombing raids or captured by enemy forces. The approaching winter of 1943 marked 2 years since the artworks had arrived at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on how completely the operation had been integrated into the rhythm of daily life at the estate. The armed guards had become familiar figures to regular visitors. The restricted areas had been seamlessly incorporated into tour routes, and the elaborate deceptions had become so natural that maintaining them required little conscious effort. Yet beneath this surface, normalcy lay the constant awareness that they were participating in something historically unprecedented. The love story that had created Biltmore had evolved into a testament to the power of private virtue to serve public necessity, demonstrating how individual sacrifice could preserve collective heritage during humanity's darkest hours. Edith often stood at the windows that overlooked the gardens where she and George had once walked together, thinking about how their shared dreams had led to this moment when their home served as a fortress protecting the very essence of American culture. The flowers that bloomed each spring in those gardens seemed to symbolize the enduring power of beauty to survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy it. The artworks that waited in their hidden sanctuary represented the same triumph of human creativity over forces of destruction. They had survived centuries of wars, revolutions, and natural disasters to reach this moment when they needed protection from the greatest threat civilization had ever faced. The love that had built Biltmore was proving strong enough to shield them through this crisis, just as it had sheltered the Vanderbilt family through personal tragedies and triumphs. As 1944 began, everyone involved in the operation understood that they were entering what might be the final phase of their mission. Allied forces were preparing for the massive invasion that would open a second front in Europe, bringing the war closer to its eventual conclusion. But victory remained uncertain, and the possibility of German retaliation against American targets meant that the artworks would need to remain hidden until peace was finally achieved. The estate continued its double life with practiced efficiency, welcoming thousands of visitors who marveled at the magnificence of the Vanderbilt mansion while remaining completely unaware that they were walking through one of the most important military installations in the country. The success of this elaborate deception had become so complete that it seemed almost effortless, though everyone involved knew how much careful planning and constant vigilance were required to maintain it. The bonds forged among the people protecting America's cultural treasures had grown stronger with each passing month, creating relationships that transcended their professional obligations. They had become a family united by shared purpose and mutual dependence, understanding that the success of their mission required absolute trust and unwavering commitment from everyone involved. The love story that had begun on an ocean liner decades earlier had become the foundation for something far greater than personal happiness. It had created a legacy of service that could protect the very soul of American civilization during its greatest trial, proving that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history itself. The spring of 1944 brought with it a transformation in the global conflict that would forever alter the trajectory of the Biltmore operation. Allied forces were massing in England for what everyone understood would be the decisive campaign to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation. The massive buildup of men and materials represented humanity's greatest gamble, a coordinated effort that would either crush the Nazi war machine or result in catastrophic failure that could prolong the conflict for years. David Finley found himself caught between conflicting pressures as military planners began questioning whether the resources devoted to protecting artwork might be better utilized supporting the upcoming invasion. High-ranking officials who had never fully understood the cultural significance of the Biltmore operation saw an opportunity to redeploy personnel and equipment to more obviously military purposes. The debates that ensued revealed fundamental differences in how various government leaders understood the relationship between cultural preservation and military victory. Some argued that winning the war was the only priority that mattered, while others maintained that preserving the values and achievements that made victory meaningful was equally essential to ultimate success. Edith Vanderbilt's voice proved decisive in these discussions, her credibility as someone who had already sacrificed enormously lending weight to her arguments for continued protection. She understood that premature exposure of the artworks could prove catastrophic if German forces managed to launch retaliatory attacks against American targets. Her decades of experience in managing complex social and political relationships served her well as she navigated the treacherous waters of wartime bureaucracy. The resolution came through a compromise that satisfied both military efficiency and cultural preservation concerns. The Biltmore operation would continue with slightly reduced security, but additional precautions would be implemented to prepare for potential emergency evacuation if circumstances required moving the artworks again. This decision reflected growing confidence in Allied military prospects while acknowledging that the war was far from over. The announcement of the successful invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought celebrations throughout the estate that had to be carefully managed to to avoid revealing why this news was particularly significant to the hidden operation. Staff members who knew about the artworks understood that the opening of the Second Front marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, bringing closer the day when their precious charges could safely return to public display. Yet, everyone involved also recognized that desperate enemies often proved most dangerous in their final throes. Reports of German development of new weapons capable of reaching American targets reinforced the wisdom of maintaining maximum security until victory was absolutely certain. The rocket attacks on London demonstrated that technological innovation could extend the range of warfare in ways that made no location completely safe. The summer of 1944 witnessed the most intensive period of visitor activity in Biltmore's history as Americans, increasingly confident of eventual victory, sought to experience the cultural treasures that represented what they were fighting to preserve. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that tourists came to admire the Vanderbilt collection while standing just yards away from even greater treasures they could never imagine were hidden nearby. Managing these unprecedented crowds while maintaining operational security required every skill that Edith had developed through decades of hosting social events and managing public relationships. She found herself serving simultaneously as gracious hostess, security coordinator, and keeper of one of the most important secrets in American history. The strain was enormous, but her commitment never wavered. The estate staff rose to meet these challenges with dedication that reflected their deep loyalty to both the Vanderbilt family and the national mission they were supporting. Groundskeepers maintained perfect landscaping while discreetly monitoring for signs of suspicious activity. Tour guides managed increased visitor loads while carefully steering groups away from restricted areas. Kitchen staff prepared meals for both tourists and security personnel without revealing the true nature of the enhanced protection measures. Cornelia proved invaluable during this period, her youthful energy and fresh perspective bringing new ideas for managing the complex logistics of their double life. She developed innovative crowd control techniques that appeared to enhance visitor experience while actually improving security monitoring. Her natural charm and genuine enthusiasm for sharing Biltmore's history made her an ideal ambassador for maintaining the estate's public image. The autumn months brought news from Europe that made everyone connected to the operation increasingly optimistic about the war's eventual outcome. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, German resistance was showing signs of collapse, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy capability to threaten American targets was rapidly diminishing. These developments prompted renewed discussions about when it might be safe to begin planning the return of the artworks to Washington. Finley found himself caught between his desire to restore normal operations at the National Gallery and his recognition that premature action could still prove disastrous if the war took an unexpected turn. The decision-making process was complicated by the fact that the Biltmore operation had proven so successful that some officials argued for making it permanent. The artworks had never been safer or better protected than they were in their mountain fortress, and the security arrangements that had been developed could serve as a model for protecting cultural treasures during future crises. Edith's position on these discussions reflected her deep understanding of both the practical and symbolic importance of returning the artworks to public display. While she had been honored to serve as their guardian during the nation's darkest hour, she knew that these masterpieces belonged in museums where they could fulfill their true purpose of inspiring and educating the American people. The winter of 1944 marked 3 years since the artworks had arrived at Biltmore, a milestone that prompted reflection on everything that had been accomplished and preserved during this extraordinary period. The secret had been kept perfectly despite countless opportunities for exposure. The artworks remained in pristine condition despite being housed in facilities never intended for such purposes. Most remarkably, the operation had demonstrated that private citizens could serve their country in ways that went far beyond traditional concepts of patriotic duty. The love story that had created Biltmore had evolved into something that protected the very essence of American civilization during its greatest trial. The bonds that had formed among the people involved in the operation had grown stronger with each passing month, creating relationships that transcended their official responsibilities. They had become a family united by shared purpose and absolute trust, understanding that their success depended on unwavering commitment from everyone involved. As 1945 began, the signs of impending victory became increasingly unmistakable. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Their capacity for offensive action had been virtually eliminated, and intelligence reports suggested that the Nazi regime was beginning to collapse from within. Yet, the possibility of desperate last-ditch attacks against American targets meant that vigilance remained essential until final victory was achieved. The estate continued its remarkable double life with practiced efficiency, but everyone could sense the approaching end of their extraordinary mission. The artworks that had waited patiently in their hidden sanctuary would soon be able to return to the public display they had been created to enjoy. Edith found herself experiencing conflicting emotions as she contemplated the eventual end of the operation that had defined her life for over 3 years. While she looked forward to returning to a more normal existence, she also recognized that serving as guardian of America's greatest cultural treasures had been the most meaningful work of her entire life. The love story that had begun with George and Edith's meeting on an ocean liner had reached its ultimate expression in this act of national service. Their shared vision of using privilege to serve others had evolved into something that could protect the artistic achievements of centuries during humanity's darkest hour. The flowers that bloomed each spring in the gardens they had created together seemed to symbolize the enduring power of beauty to survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy it. The artworks hidden within their home represented the same triumph of human creativity over forces of destruction. The approaching liberation of Europe brought with it reports that confirmed the wisdom of every precaution that had been taken to protect America's cultural treasures. Allied forces advancing through Germany discovered the full extent of Nazi art looting operations, finding warehouses filled with stolen masterpieces and evidence of systematic destruction of works deemed unacceptable by Nazi ideology. The photographs and testimonies that emerged from these discoveries served as stark reminders of what could have been lost if different decisions had been made during those crucial months in 1941 and 1942. The artworks that had found sanctuary at Biltmore represented not just individual masterpieces, but entire traditions of human creativity that would have been obliterated if they had fallen into enemy hands. The vindication of their efforts brought both relief and renewed determination to maintain security until absolute victory was achieved. Everyone involved understood that their success had preserved something irreplaceable for future generations, demonstrating how individual sacrifice could serve collective benefit in ways that changed the course of history. As spring returned to the mountains of North Carolina in 1945, the estate prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final phase of their extraordinary mission. The war in Europe was entering its closing stages, but the conflict in the Pacific reminded everyone that global victory remained incomplete. The artworks that had waited so patiently in their hidden sanctuary had become symbols of everything America was fighting to preserve. They represented not just artistic achievement, but the values of beauty, truth, and human dignity that gave meaning to the struggle against tyranny and hatred. The bonds forged among the people protecting these treasures had created something that would endure long after the war ended. They had proven that love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's soul, that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that honored both individual sacrifice and collective heritage. The love story that had created Biltmore was approaching its most triumphant chapter, as the fortress built by two hearts would soon release the cultural treasures it had protected back to a world finally safe enough to celebrate beauty without fear. The greatest love story of duty in American history was about to reach its magnificent conclusion, proving that some things are indeed worth risking everything to protect. The announcement that came crackling through radio sets across America on May 8, 1945, brought celebrations that had been building in hearts for years. victory in Europe. The Nazi regime had finally collapsed, Hitler was dead, and the war that had consumed the continent for 6 devastating years was finally over. At Biltmore Estate, the news arrived like spring rain after the longest drought in memory, washing away years of tension and fear with the sweet promise of peace restored. But for those who knew the secret hidden within the mountain mansion's walls, this moment carried significance that went far beyond the general celebration sweeping across the nation. The artworks that had waited so patiently in their hidden sanctuary were finally safe from the threat that had driven them into exile. The greatest cultural treasures of American civilization could begin their journey home. Edith Vanderbilt stood in the music room for the first time since the steel doors had been sealed 3.5 years earlier, gazing upon the masterpieces that had transformed her home into something unprecedented in American history. The works by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Van Dyck seemed to glow in the carefully controlled lighting, as if they too understood that their long vigil was approaching its end. The process of preparing for the artwork's departure required the same meticulous planning that had characterized their arrival, but now the secrecy that had protected them could gradually give way to celebration. David Finley arrived from Washington with a team of specialists who would oversee every aspect of the return journey, their faces bright with relief and satisfaction at having successfully completed one of the most challenging cultural preservation efforts in human history. The conversations that took place during those final planning sessions carried an emotional weight that went far beyond mere logistics. These people had shared something extraordinary, had proven that private citizens could serve their country in ways that transcended traditional concepts of patriotic duty. The bonds they had forged through years of maintaining absolute secrecy would endure long after their official responsibilities ended. The estate staff who had been trusted with the secret found themselves experiencing conflicting emotions as they contemplated the end of their extraordinary mission. They had served as guardians of America's greatest cultural treasures, participating in something that would be remembered as one of the most successful security operations in the nation's history. Yet, they also looked forward to returning to the simpler rhythms of normal life. Cornelia proved invaluable during this transition period, her energy and organizational skills helping to coordinate the complex logistics of returning the estate to purely civilian operations. The security measures that had been so carefully concealed would need to be removed with the same discretion that had characterized their installation, leaving no trace of the fortress that had existed within the elegant mansion. The technical challenges of preparing the artworks for transport required updating the protective systems that had been developed during their original journey to North Carolina. Advances in material science and transportation technology made possible improvements that would ensure even greater safety during their return to Washington, reflecting the lessons learned through years of caring for these irreplaceable treasures. Each painting received individual attention from conservators who examined every detail for signs of deterioration or damage that might have occurred during their mountain exile. The results exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. The climate-controlled environment and security measures had preserved these masterpieces in condition that was actually better than when they had arrived, proving the effectiveness of the unprecedented preservation effort. Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, the iconic image that had symbolized American values throughout the war, was among the first pieces prepared for departure. The face that had gazed from currency and classrooms across the nation would soon return to public display, carrying with it the story of how private sacrifice had protected the symbols of democratic ideals during their greatest trial. The summer of 1945 brought a different atmosphere to Biltmore as visitors arrived with new understanding of what the estate represented. The war's end had revealed the full extent of cultural destruction that had occurred across Europe, making Americans increasingly aware of how precious and fragile their own artistic heritage truly was. The tourists who walked through the magnificent rooms seemed to appreciate more deeply the beauty and significance of what they were experiencing. The staff who had maintained the estate's public operations throughout the secret years found themselves able to relax in ways they had almost forgotten were possible. The constant vigilance that had characterized every interaction with visitors could finally give way to the genuine hospitality that had always been Biltmore's hallmark. Tour guides no longer needed to carefully steer groups away from restricted areas, and security personnel could focus on normal protection rather than counterintelligence operations. Edith discovered that the end of her role as guardian of America's cultural treasures brought both relief and an unexpected sense of loss. The responsibility had been enormous and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also given her life a purpose that went beyond personal interests. She had proven to herself and to history that the values she and George had shared could serve something far greater than their own happiness. The conversation she had with David Finley during those final weeks revealed the depth of friendship that had made their extraordinary collaboration possible. Their relationship had been tested by years of shared secrets and mutual dependence, emerging stronger and more meaningful than either had imagined possible when their wartime partnership began. The planning for the artwork's departure required coordination with multiple government agencies and security services. But now, the elaborate deceptions that had characterized the operation could be replaced with more straightforward procedures. The return journey would be conducted with appropriate dignity rather than covert secrecy, reflecting the nation's growing confidence in its ability to protect its cultural heritage through normal means. The selection of the departure date carried symbolic significance that honored both the practical requirements of the operation and the emotional needs of everyone who had participated in this unprecedented effort. They chose a clear day in late August, when the mountain air was crisp and the summer crowds had diminished, allowing for a ceremony that balanced security concerns with appropriate recognition of what had been accomplished. The night before the departure, Edith walked alone through the gardens where she and George had once planned their shared future, thinking about how their love story had evolved into something that protected the artistic achievements of centuries. The flowers that bloomed around her seemed to whisper of all the beauty that would endure because of the choices made by people who understood that some things were worth risking everything to preserve. The morning of August 23rd brought perfect weather for the most significant departure in Biltmore's history. The convoy that assembled in the circular drive looked remarkably similar to the vehicles that had arrived through a snowstorm 3.5 years earlier, but now they carried the confidence of a nation that had proven its ability to protect what mattered most. The loading process proceeded with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of the operation, but now the atmosphere was one of celebration rather than desperate urgency. Each crate that left the music room represented not just a rescued masterpiece, but a victory over the forces that would have destroyed the highest achievements of human creativity. David Finley supervised every detail of the departure with emotions that reflected the magnitude of what was ending. The friendship with Edith Vanderbilt that had made this operation possible had been tested and strengthened through years of shared responsibility for protecting America's cultural soul. Their collaboration had proven that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history. The moment when the steel doors of the music room closed for the final time marked the end of an era that would be remembered as one of the most successful cultural preservation efforts in human history. The space that had served as America's most secret fortress would return to its intended purpose, but it would forever carry the memory of the treasures it had protected during the nation's darkest hour. The convoy's departure from Biltmore received the kind of public celebration that had been impossible during the artwork's secret arrival. Motorcycle escorts with sirens blazing, photographers documenting every moment, and crowds of well-wishers who finally understood what had been hidden in their mountain community for over 3 years. The contrast between secret arrival and triumphant departure symbolized everything about America's journey from vulnerable isolation to confident victory. Edith stood on the front steps of the house she had shared with George, watching until the last vehicle disappeared around the curve of the approach road. The estate felt different now, somehow both emptier and more peaceful than it had been for years. The extraordinary chapter of her life was ending, but the legacy of what had been accomplished would endure forever. The love story that had begun on an ocean liner in 1897 had reached its most magnificent conclusion, proving that private affection could create something strong enough to protect the very essence of civilization during its greatest trial. The fortress that love had built had served its purpose perfectly, demonstrating that individual sacrifice could preserve collective heritage in ways that honored both personal devotion and national service. The artworks that had found sanctuary in the mountains of North Carolina carried with them the story of how Americans had chosen to protect beauty rather than surrender to fear. How private citizens had served their country in ways that transcended traditional concepts of patriotic duty. How love could indeed become the foundation for protecting a nation's soul. The greatest love story of duty in American history had reached its triumphant ending, but its influence would continue echoing through generations of Americans who would visit museums and galleries without ever knowing how close they had come to losing the masterpieces that defined their cultural heritage. The secret fortress had returned its treasures to the world, but the love that had protected them would remain forever as a testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when they understood that some things were truly worth risking everything to preserve. Worth risking everything to preserve. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary tale that began with two hearts finding each other on the deck of an ocean liner and culminated in the protection of America's cultural soul during its darkest hour. The love story of George and Edith Vanderbilt proved that private virtue could serve public necessity in ways that changed the course of history itself. What started as a romance built on shared dreams of beauty and service evolved into something far greater than personal happiness. It became the foundation for one of the most successful cultural preservation efforts in human history, demonstrating that when love creates something meaningful, it possesses the strength to protect what matters most when everything hangs in the balance. The secret that was kept for over 3 years at Biltmore Estate saved masterpieces by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and countless other masters from the forces that destroyed so much of Europe's artistic heritage. But more than that, it proved that individual acts of courage and sacrifice could preserve the very essence of civilization for future generations. Today, when you visit the National Gallery of Art and stand before Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait, you're looking at more than just a painting. You're witnessing the triumph of love over hatred, of hope over despair, of ordinary people who chose to risk everything they held sacred rather than surrender to the darkness that threatened to consume the world. The fortress that love built at Biltmore may have returned its treasures to public display, but the legacy of what was accomplished there continues to remind us that the greatest acts of patriotism often happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when someone chooses to protect beauty rather than surrender to fear. This story challenges us to consider what we would be willing to risk for the sake of preserving what makes life worth living. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't found in armies or weapons, but in two hearts that understand their love can create something strong enough to shelter the soul of a nation when it needs protection most.